We might get back underway, and I call Mr. Stephen Spring. Can I just check before we get underway whether you're happy for me to record any part of your testimony?
Not a problem.
And for the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee?
Okay, my name is Stephen Gary Spring. I'm appearing as a private citizen.
And as I've been saying for every witness, these hearings are formal proceedings of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. And I'd like to start by inviting you to make a short statement.
Thank you. What I'd like to do today is present some of my story, and then I'm quite happy to answer some questions at the end. So some of it's a little bit technical, but what it will help, hopefully it will help the committee do, is understand some of the difficulties and problems in in-area research. Okay, so I was diagnosed with Meniere's disease by Professor Bill Gibson in 2004, and I was 38. I was told by a Professor Halmagyi that I should be expecting retirement, and I was quite devastated. I went on to become the Vice President of the Meniere's Research Fund at Sydney University, and I believe that Daniel Brown, who is the Fellow at Sydney University at the Meniere's Research Fund, gave evidence this morning.
He was our first witness, yeah.
I essentially became very frustrated with the glacial level of in-area research. I found it extremely frustrating partly because I had a personal interest in getting it better as fast as I could, but also with the way that the whole structure of in-area research in Australia takes place. Now, I was very lucky that I found a friend of an advocate, a guy called Bill Gibson, and Bill Gibson, which you may have heard of, was one of the pioneers of the cochlear implant and set up the majority of the cochlear implant centres here in Sydney. This is his autobiography. We explained some difficulties he had right at the very beginning, trying to convince the community the Cochlear Implant Centre was going to be successful. So we look upon the Cochlear Implant Centre, the Cochlear Implant Program now as being a great Australian initiative, whereas it wasn't back then. I'm quite happy to present it as an exhibit if you'd want to take it. So I was stuck with this dilemma where I had Meniere's disease. Nobody could help me. There was no cure. I ended up having a situation where I had to do a lot of private research myself, and I run a legal practice. And what I did is I set up a war room and accumulated well over 3,000 research articles, and I employed some people to privately help me understand what was going wrong with me. Bill Gibson, he taught me that Meniere's disease is a disease of the endolymphatic sac. Now, the endolymphatic sac is this organ here that hangs off the end of the vestibular apparatus here, and that is actually the immune node of the ear. It's the immune defence organ of the inner ear. And when that goes wrong in Meniere's disease, it has implications on the vestibular system as well as the cochlea. So you don't just have balance problems, you have hearing loss, and you have tinnitus and all those other problems that you may have been alerted to by Meniere's Australia, World, World, who may have also given evidence. Trouble is, though, is the endolymphatic sac is a tiny little organ that's buried right down in the middle of the skull, and there's very little you can actually do with it, although various different surgeries have been tried over the years. But the long and the short is it's known to be an incurable and degenerative condition. The research that I did, and there was over 7 years of it, led me to believe that I had some genetic defects in my immune system. So privately, I undertook a whole series of genetic tests and immune tests, and I discovered that there was actually a lot of research that had been done in the 1970s and 80s by pioneers who had discovered a lot of these problems, but the actual research itself was not translated into medicine, and it languished in the books and the journals of the day. And I essentially travelled around the world to various different things, and Bill Gibson introduced me to a number of these professors that had run major research organisations back in the 70s and 80s and who had retired. So I embarked on a program with another guy called Lindsay Wing, who was looking at inner ear problems as an immunological problem. So whereas traditionally now people that have problems with inner ears, it becomes a surgical issue, and if it becomes so bad, you get cochlear implants. The researchers and the research path that I took was to look at the immunology of the inner ear. For various different reasons, and I won't go into some of the technicalities, is a lot of people that do have Meniere's disease, and we're up nearly 75%, they have genetic defects, which at the moment they're detectable, but they're unrecognised. Right? I actually went on to develop a vaccine, and I've been working with a number of Meniere's disease patients through their doctors to develop a program where their immune system is changed to be able to rehabilitate the endolymphatic sac. All right. Now, people with Meniere's disease have much higher rates of autoimmune disease, they have much higher rates of diabetes, and they have much higher rates of heart disease. All right. So it's a systemic disease, and your committee may think that the hearing loss and the tinnitus is bad, the vertigo is much worse, but left untreated, it has enormous systemic effects later on down the track. The way that inner ear research is structured in Australia is extremely disparate. And my time at the Meniere's Research Fund, and I'm quite sure Daniel would have told you this, is that the funding model for inner ear research is essentially you compete for funds and the rest of it's all private. The work that I did cost me an absolute fortune, but I really had no choice. I was stuck in a situation where I was the afflicted one. And the Meniere's Research Fund, which was set up by Bill Gibson and Bruce Kirkpatrick, and of who Selene up the end there has also been a member for many years, is essentially volunteer work, and the money originally came from philanthropy. I think this is very short-sighted because solving the problem before we even get to cochlear implants seems to me to be a much better solution. I've now been able to develop a series of genetic tests and a genetic algorithm, and hopefully I'll be putting that into good use over the next few years. So what I really want to be able to talk about today is the disconnect between ENT, audiologists and immunology. And that has a particular Australian relevance because similar genetic defects that are found in people with Meniere's are also rampant in the Australian Aboriginal population. And that is probably one of the contributory reasons why they suffer much higher rates of hearing loss, and especially when they're young, it goes on to have enormous impact upon not just the general community, but their learning and their behavioural. There was a day when Australia used to be a world leader in some of these, the cutting edge. But what we tend not to be able to do is to translate that into adequate treatments. So part of the problem is, in my experience through the Meniere's Research Fund, was that it takes a group of people who are passionate about a particular disease, certainly in this case, to get private funds together, and then the NMHRC funding will then supplement the various different projects that they have. The problem is, though, is that none of that's integrated. And we have a situation where you've got people doing inner ear research in a bit of Europe and a little bit of America and a little bit here. I mean, Daniel Brown's laboratory at the Brain and Mind Institute is the only Meniere's research-specific laboratory in the whole of the world. All right? They can punch above their weight, but unless all the little ends are all being stuck together, you don't get the full picture. And Daniel Brown and he doesn't have a clinical arm, so anything that's new and innovative is going to be tested in animals, and then he's going to hit a barrier because he's not going to be able to translate that into clinical trials because the money is not going to be there. And what I'm suggesting that the committee might like to consider is that, Daniel Brown, he's developed a very innovative diagnostic tool for detecting Meniere's disease early. We can't get it into market, all right? I've developed this immunological treatment. It's almost impossible to get it into market. And so what I'm suggesting is that what we need to do is we need to look at a funding model where much of this stuff is integrated, and probably the best model to look at would be the one that Chris O'Brien set up at the Lifehouse over in Camperdown, where he was able to, as a cancer survivor himself, or whilst he didn't survive, he was a cancer patient himself, he was able to look at the research, the doctors treating, the support groups, and integrating all of that into one single model where the research became translational medicine. And out of that became a much greater understanding that cancer is numerous different diseases. And I think that's the kind of model that needs to take place. We don't have in this country a centre of excellence for ear and balance health. We just don't have it. Now, Stephen O'Leary, he runs the Bill Gibson Professorship down in Melbourne. There's little bits like that, but there's nothing that pulls them all together that says, why aren't we looking at prevention? And I think it's the way that the industry has developed over a period of time. It's not something which is anybody's fault, but I think taking things forward, if we're going to take hearing and balance as a serious health implication for our ageing population, integrating all of those disciplines together, as Stephen O'Leary said, sometimes you have to be able to have a multidisciplinary approach, especially when you've got children. And that, to me, seems to be the best way. So from an innovative research point of view, it shouldn't really be up to private individuals to scratch around when the benefit for the community, if there is successful translational medicine, is going to far outweigh the initial investment. And if we've only got to look at the cochlear implant program, of which right at the very beginning it was one or two individuals, they needed state money to be able to kick that thing off. The Chris O'Brien Centre, so the Lighthouse Centre, it needed state money and federal money to kick that off, because it's beyond the capacity of individuals, even if they're very, they're quite rich philanthropists. It's simply, we're talking tens of millions, but the benefit to the community by prevention far outweighs the 10 million. I would like to be able to sort of simply summarise by saying that we do have the ability to be world leaders if we have if we're able to integrate the infrastructure. So Daniel Brown's work, my work from Stephen O'Leary, all of these things can come together. And at the moment you've got little pockets of it that don't seem to be able to be talking to each other. And that, to me, is a very inefficient way of running something which is so fundamentally important to people's health.
Thank you. Do you want to start off?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Spring, thank you for appearing before the committee, and I commend you for the extraordinary effort that you've made towards finding solutions. It would seem to me that your pitch is that there ought to be a coordinated effort made, and that should come from government in terms of either providing funding or, in fact, by pulling it together. Can I ask you this? Has there been any attempt, to your knowledge, by the various pockets which are currently working in silos to actually come together? Has anyone actually suggested it from amongst whatever little there is out there, at least to come together and share your work? Or would it be your perception that they all prefer to work in silos because they each want to have their own small domain?
You've hit the nail right on the head. Part of the problem with the general research community is they like to be able to work in silos because each one's chasing their own particular field of interest. And once they build up this bank of NHMRC funding, they continue on with that and it becomes self-funding. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but if the way that you're getting information is competitive, and the way that you're getting information is via the medical journals, there's gaps between them, and the great brainstormed ideas of the medical profession that have led to the cochlear implant, for instance, have only come out when people have collaborated. And again, let's go back to the cochlear implant. It took electronics, it took audiologists, it took ENT surgeons, and it took a whole series of normally disparate professions to talk to each other to say, well, hang on, we can actually do this. Right? And I think that's where we need to go. And unfortunately, immunology and the massive impact that it has on on hearing health is not really taken as far as it could be. And I think this is the gap that needs to be filled, and it probably would take a coordinated effort, if the funding's available by government, to bring those people together.
Thank you.
I was going to ask, for those of us that haven't had direct experience of Meniere's disease, whether you could give us a snapshot of how the disease manifests itself and what life was like for you and
Okay, well, so look,
you were
originally,
diagnosed and how it deteriorated.
yeah,
and
look,
so on.
I'm with the program that I've done.
Yeah.
I have a very slight hearing loss, and I have a minuscule bit of tinnitus. Right, so I'm one of the lucky ones because I've been able to help myself with other people around. However, what normally happens is the first sign is either a violent vertigo attack, when the room simply starts to spin, and this is because the fluid that's inside the endolymphatic sac is actually stimulating your vestibular organs. So therefore you have no control over it. It's often accompanied by vomiting because your brain becomes disorientated. Most people tend to fall to the floor because they can't stand up. You end up with a roaring tinnitus, which is it's probably like standing next to a jet engine. All right. And eventually, at the beginning, it will subside, but eventually, those symptoms can often merge into one. So you have constant tinnitus, and then eventually, over a period of time, you'll start to lose your hearing, and that is because as the inner ear starts to break down, the delicate hair cells that are in the cochlea start to become damaged. It becomes fibrotic, and when it becomes fibrotic, the ear has no method of cleaning itself out, essentially, all right? And therefore the disease sets in, it becomes degenerative. So not only do you lose all your sense of who you are because you can't communicate with the world, you lose your orientation because you can't stand up. And if having chronic imbalance means that you can't walk on sand, having chronic imbalance means that you can't drive a car. It means that you're too frightened to go out down the street to pick up your groceries, because if you have a Meniere's attack whilst you're there, you're going to be on the ground prostrate throwing up. So that's the kind of thing that people end up living with. Now, there is various different degrees of the severity. For some people, it's a minor nuisance. But for some people, it is completely devastating. Right? I mean, I was unlucky that I ended up with a really devastating form.
And so the research that you've done, and,
Yes.
and you talked about the treatment that you've helped develop.
Yeah.
So is that now being more widely used, or?
Well, it's one of those things that I can help people via their doctors.
Yeah.
Right? There is a small program that I've been running privately via doctors, and there is some interest with the Healthy Hearing and Balance Centre up in Bondi Junction, right? Because those people understand what Meniere's disease is, right? The trouble with a lot of ENT surgeons, they don't get the immunology connection. So because it's not a standard kind of treatment, what they tend to do is they do the conventional treatments that have been proven not to work, and then when it gets so bad, they say, don't worry, you can have a cochlear implant. All right. So the treatment that I've been working on is all designed about preventing the disease getting worse. And if there's a little bit of damage, it doesn't mean that your hearing might come back 100%. But if it comes back 75%, that's much better than, or 80%, and having your balance back again.
Yeah.
That's preventing the disease from becoming more degenerative.
Georgiana?
Well, I haven't got any questions, only that hear you strong and loudly about the coordination of the different groups working in silos and how important that is. having said that, we've got to, I suppose, following on from Tony's question, is there a way that you can get them together? How do you get them? And are they willing to work with one another? That's the big question. I mean, it's easier said than actually getting them and putting them together. You may have a...
Yeah, well, my view is that
process.
everybody that works in medical research do so for the right reasons. There are going to be some people that want to get rich and famous, but there's also going to be a whole bunch of people that simply want to plod away and contribute to society. and if their name gets on papers, well, that's fantastic. So, I mean, there is various models, like over at the New South Wales University, the Lowy Foundation have donated large amounts of money for genetic research. They provided the money for the hardware, and that took the New South Wales government and a couple of other government organisations to be able to say, okay, well, if we've got some money, we'll contribute equal amounts, and we'll put you in a room, in a box that's specifically designed for this kind of thing, and we can run patients through here, and the amount of information that we get can then be used for translational research. Right? The Chris O'Brien situation, when he set up Lifehouse, was based on a similar model. Now, it's beyond the capacity of any one philanthropist, and it's beyond the capacity of any one organisation to be able to stick all that together. And I think it requires a concerted effort, probably from state government and from federal and from federal government, and the people that have the expertise and the skills on the ground to be able to say that's the vision that we need to share.
Thank you.
Look, thanks very much for coming along today. Meniere's disease is, I know, a terrible disease, and my father had it, and was very disabled by it towards the end of his life.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, but I'm interested to hear some of the things that you've said. I haven't actually read much about, such as that there are genetic defects identified in Meniere's disease.
Yes. Well, what happens is the body has an inability to recognise and to process viral and bacterial antigens, right? And therefore, you have a gene dose effect where some people have these low copy numbers of these genes, and some people have normal copy numbers in these genes, and this plays out in because Meniere's disease is a disease of Caucasians mainly, and most of it's Northern European, right? Now, we have a population here in Australia where we have a vast amounts of people that have genes from the Northern European gene pool, right? And it's the same. Some of those same gene defects are prevalent in the North Australian Aboriginal population, right? And it's partly because of the way that the human population has become fairly isolated in certain parts. But when we have immigrants that come from Northern Europe, and we're looking for solutions, we have to take their genetic background into account.
Have they identified these genes?
You can do well. The cost of gene sequencing used to be $15,000-$20,000 ago. Nowadays, it's relatively cheap at a couple of $1,000s, right? So it's not that difficult to identify if you know what you're looking for. There's no point going ahead and trying to do gene studies where you're trying to find a needle in a haystack.
No,
right?
But is there any papers published that have identified the gene?
There's numerous papers that have been published, and what I did is I basically brought all these little parts together.
Right.
All right. And at the moment, the gene sequencing, now it's become cheap, I want to incorporate into my treatment as a first screen. All right. And hopefully in the next couple of years, we will be able to publish some papers about that. But as I said before...
But as yet, there's nothing published.
Well, no. Majority of this stuff was done in the 70s and 80s, but it tended not to be recognised. What they knew at the time was much more limited than what they know now.
Right. Okay. And you said that you've developed a vaccine for this disease?
Yes, there's a particular way that you can get antigens into the body. That's not an injectable. It's a sublingual development, right? And
Sorry, could you just explain?
sublingual, it goes under your tongue, all right? So it goes under your tongue, the antigens are then recognised by the immune system. It's typical immunotherapy, but done in a slightly different way. And this was pioneered by a guy called Lindsay Wing, who was nearly 90 when I met him 10 years ago, and he was kind of laughed at by the ENT community because he was doing immunotherapy to help his Meniere's patients And unfortunately he had a heart attack, and then he stopped practicing, right? But immunotherapy has now become the way of treating cancers. In other words, you're using your body's own immune system to be able to stimulate it properly in the right way to be able to help solve some of the diseases which are impossible to solve any other way. And so the vaccine that I've developed is essentially a series of antigens that stimulate the immune system in a particular way that goes to overcoming the gene defect that is inherent in those people.
One would have to say, from my reading, though, there's no proof or no...
No, that is exactly right.
Okay. Have you been able... I mean, Bill Gibson's retired now. Have you been able to interest any particular ENT research group into picking up on your theories? Or?
Yes. I've travelled to a number of different conferences. I know Stephen O'Leary. We put in various different government grants for NHMRC, but as it comes back to, you're competing with everybody else.
Yeah.
And I mean, I understand there's a limited amount of funds, and sometimes you are at the bottom of the pile.
Yeah.
And the other thing about immunology and the ENT profession is that never the twain will meet. And so a lot of the stuff that you do...
Be careful, I think there's a couple of ENT surgeons behind you.
I think they'll probably...
They might have their knives out.
I think they'll probably... I think they'll probably concede that that's the case.
Yeah. I mean, Dr. Brown this morning made a similar point to you, that there is more of a need for research into Meniere's and balance disorders.
Yes.
And he was lamenting the fact that some of the ENT surgeons in the past that had an interest were retiring, and there was a need to set up a specific Meniere's research group. And it would seem to me that that's what you're asking for.
Well, I suppose what I'm saying is that Daniel Brown is essentially little much more than a one-man band,
yes.
and I'm little much more than a one-man band.
Yeah.
And bringing all these things together with proper government funding to do things preventatively,
Mm-hmm.
I believe it'll have much greater impact long term. And the other thing is very important to realise, I think, is, well, and you just touched upon it, to the point about Bill Gibson retiring, right? Now, Bill Gibson, as a pioneer, developed a lot of techniques to detect endolymphatic hydrops, which is the medical name for Meniere's disease, and it requires a doctor to be able to insert a needle through the eardrum to touch essentially a little membrane that's inside the inner ear. Now, there's very few people in Australia that do that.
Yep.
So therefore, when you go along and you've got Meniere's disease, but you don't know and you're undiagnosed, you go along to a doctor, you say, I've got these symptoms, and they go, well, we can only go on symptoms because there's no real test. But the truth of the matter is that Bill Gibson has been teaching people around the world how to do this test, and it's the gold standard. But it's not properly taught in the universities, and very, very few people pick up on that. And whilst he's written books, it's not something that's structured, and things tend to get lost in the system.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming along today and giving evidence.
Thank you.
You'll be provided with a transcript of today's proceedings, and if there's any issues arising from that, please contact the committee secretariat. And it's been quite a fascinating insight, so thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.